in the beginning of Romans 10, we saw that Paul's desire is that the Jewish people be saved. We saw that he sees that with their God-given zeal, with their godly zeal, but not understanding, raise up their own righteousness. And by raising up their own righteousness, they fail to submit to the righteousness that God has given. Now you have to understand that I am translating here from the Greek text, and we normally work with translations, and translations are tricky. But we have to understand the train of thoughts that Paul is coming, and we are now coming in verse 4, in Romans 10 verse 4, to one of those passages that is one of the most tricky passages to translate, maybe even in the Bible. And theology is split here. It says there, and I translate now, for Messiah is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. And the question is, how do we understand it? How do we understand it in the train of thoughts that Paul is developing here? And how do we understand these words properly? Very often it has been translated that Messiah, Christ, is the end of the Torah, the end of the Old Testament, in a sense that it is the dissolution, the termination, the cancellation, the cessation of the validity of everything that is written by Jewish people in what we call the Old Testament. Actually, the very term we use here, the Old Testament, for what is written in Hebrew, is testifying to this kind of theology. We say now something new is coming in, that with Christ we have the New Testament. And here it says, Messiah, Christ is the end of the law. And we have now a righteousness in faith. Is that true? In Romans 3, in verse 33, Paul has asked this question because he makes statements that could be understood in that way. And he asked the question, do we then dissolve the law, the Torah, through this kind of faith? And he shouts there, by no means. Perish the thought, rather we establish the Torah. And in Romans 7, he underlines, he says, we know that the Torah is spiritual, or I might also translate it that the Torah, that what we call the Old Testament, is a spiritual gift. Paul says nothing, and I'm just quoting here a few passages throughout his life. He says, he claims in front of Agrippas, I'm saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass. Or in another incident, he said, he expounded to them, testifying of the kingdom of the one true God, persuading them concerning Yeshua from the Torah of Moses and the prophets, from early in the morning until late at night. That was actually towards the end of his life in Rome, where he had the Jewish people, the Jewish scribes, Jewish rabbis, we would say today, sitting around him. And he had just this. He did not have the New Testament in that sense. He used Torah, the Torah and the prophets, in proving, convincing them that Yeshua, Jesus, is the Messiah. And we have many passages where he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that Christ, or the Messiah, was Yeshua. And we come from a Christian tradition that tried to show that the law is over and a new time breaks in with Christ and cancels the old. But this cannot be meant if we understand Paul as a whole. Paul exclusively, if we go back to Romans 10, and if you look at this text in context, he exclusively argues from the Torah and proves wrong thinking versus right thinking from the chapters of Torah. He takes out of the law. The question is, what means fulfillment, or what means telos? What means the word termination? Does it mean maybe perfection, fulfillment? Does Paul here want to say what a lot of Israel lovers would like to hear here, that Christ is the perfection of the Torah? In a way, as he says, do not think that I've come to terminate the Torah and the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. But if we translate telos, the word that is the end, here as perfection, fulfillment, and I have this of we would today say Messianic Jewish scholar, it's a Jewish linguist. He says it would be contrary to the language to translate it as Messiah is the fulfillment of the Torah. In Greek it would have been not telos but teleosis or pleroma that should be used here, and Paul uses it in other passages. So it's difficult to translate that Christ is the goal or the purpose of Torah. Even theologically it's right. But here in this context, it doesn't say it. Think where Paul is coming from. He says they have zeal, but through their zeal, they rose up their own righteousness. He doesn't say that it's all wrong, but he says by raising up their own righteousness, they did not submit to God's righteousness. So we have to ask, if he now goes on that Messiah is the end of the nomos, we maybe have to ask what nomos means. And I did something you should normally not do as a theologian who wants to be taken seriously. I looked up Wikipedia, and there it says that nomos is the Greek term for law, but it may also mean a custom or agreement. It is something that is valid for all living beings. Now look, I think what Paul here wants to say in Romans 10 verse 4, in the context, in the train of thoughts, he wants to say that Messiah is the end of all what we as human beings raise up and erect as law, as agreement, as something that we have always been doing. It is whatever establishes or is the foundation of our understanding of things. Messiah is the end of it. If we look for righteousness, if we look for something that comes up to God's standards, to God's measurements, then we have to look at Messiah. And that's what Paul's saying here, and that's valid even for us. It's the way he formulates here. He says Messiah, Yeshua, abrogates all directive, all the regulations that are established by men, all customs, everything that has always been done this way, all agreements, treaties, in fact, the law par excellence. He abolishes it, and we must surrender ourselves to Messiah in order to become the righteousness of the one true and only living God.